The morning Caleb Merritt first put boots on the ridge that season, the longleaf pines were holding the last of their resin smell against a low, overcast sky, and he counted 7 sets of deer tracks in the red clay of the fire lane before he reached the property marker at the northwest corner of the tract. That was the kind of thing he did without thinking about it. He counted. He measured. He wrote numbers in a yellow-covered field book with a carpenter pencil he kept clipped to the chest pocket of his canvas jacket, and the numbers he wrote were the kind that did not negotiate with optimism or fear. The tract was 180 acres of managed longleaf on a long north-facing ridge, leased from a timber company whose nearest field supervisor worked out of Tuscaloosa and came through twice a year. Caleb cruised the timber, marked the boundary lines after windfall events, and filed the reports. He had done this kind of work for 11 years across 4 counties in central Alabama. He knew red clay like he knew the grain of wood. He knew what the deer did at the low end of the ridge near the creek bottom, and he knew what the coyotes did at night along the fire lane that ran the spine of the ridge from the gate at the gravel road to the old dozer cut at the far end. He was not a man who invented things. He did not repeat himself when he told a story because he only told a story once, and he got it right the first time. The drive from the metal-sided house at the ridge's foot to the firebreak gate was 3/4 of a mile on gravel. He made it in his F250 most mornings before Sandra had the coffee started, backing the truck across the pull-through and running the window down to listen before he got out. That was habit, not caution. The ridge had a particular sound in the hour after first light. A wood thrush working the creek bottom, crows crossing the pine canopy west to east, occasionally the chatter of a red squirrel in the hardwood fringe where the pines gave way to white oak and sweet gum along the draw. He listened to all of it the way a machinist listens to an engine. Variation was data. He started every morning by taking inventory of what the ridge was doing. That part of his life had a good shape to it. He came home smelling like pine resin and red clay, and Sandra had learned not to bother him in the first 10 minutes after he pulled in, because he was still making notes in the field book, or checking the numbers on the moisture meter, or loading the footage from the trail cameras he'd had up since August, watching for a feral hog sign in the creek bottom. They had a daughter named Nora, who was 7 months old, and slept in a white-painted crib in the room at the back of the house that faced the ridge. The baby monitor sat on the kitchen counter. Sandra used the handset when she was in the garden. Caleb generally did not think about the monitor unless it made noise, which it rarely did at night, because Nora slept well in that back room, with the window cracked and the ceiling fan on low. Sandra held up his measuring tape one evening in the second week of October, turning it over in her hand like she was evaluating it for trade. He was at the table with the field book, and she was clearing the dinner plates. "You carry this thing everywhere," she said. "It's got a clip," he said. "The level has a clip. The pencil has a clip. At some point it's less a tool belt and more a religion." He looked at her over the field book. "The pencil doesn't have a clip." She put the measuring tape on the table next to his coffee. "The pencil has a clip, Caleb." She went back to the sink. He checked the pencil. It had a clip. He wrote that in the margin of the field book and did not mention it again. That was the last easy evening he could remember. Wednesday started like any other day on the ridge, except that it was the 3rd morning in a row the coyotes had been quiet He noticed it the way he noticed most things, which was without drama. Coyotes along that ridge were reliable. They ran the fire lane after midnight, called across the creek bottom at 3 or 4 a.m., and were generally done by the time the sky started to pale. He had heard them every night that fall until Sunday. Monday night, nothing. Tuesday night, nothing. Wednesday morning, he stood at the fire break gate before first light with the coffee from his dented blue thermos and listened to a ridge that was producing all of its normal sounds, except the ones the coyotes made. Wood thrush, present. Crows, on schedule. Red squirrel in the white oak fringe. No coyotes. He noted it in the field book. 3 nights. Then he went to work. The deer tracks that morning were wrong in a way he spent 20 minutes trying to explain. There was a run of whitetail sign in the clay of the fire lane. A doe, and what looked like a yearling, moving south toward the creek bottom the way they normally did. He followed the track around a bend in the fire lane, where the pines crowded closer, and the clay stayed wet in the shade. The tracks continued for another 30 feet, steady and unhurried, the stride length even. Then they stopped. Not a sprint, not a bound, no sign of a predator approach from either side. The tracks simply ended in the middle of the lane and did not resume. He walked the edges of the lane both directions from the end point, 20 feet each way, looking for the place the deer had stepped off into the pine needles. He found nothing. Deer do not levitate. He wrote the location in the field book and gave the GPS coordinates and moved on, because the work didn't stop for things he couldn't explain, and he had 2 sections of boundary line to walk before noon. He did not tell Sandra about the tracks that evening. There was nothing to tell. Tracks that stopped were odd, not alarming, and he was not in the habit of alarming people with data that didn't yet form a pattern. He checked the outer latch on the back gate after dinner, the one at the corner of the yard where the chain-link fence ended at the property line and the pine ridge started. He checked it because he checked it every night, same as the front door and the workshop lock. Pattern kept you functional. He did not linger. The ridge was dark beyond the fence, and the porch light carried maybe 30 feet into the trees before it gave up. The cat, a gray tom named Patch that Sandra had found under the truck 3 winters ago, and that now considered himself an outdoor cat from November to March, was sitting at the back door instead of ranging the yard. That was mildly unusual. Patch had opinions about where he slept, and none of them had ever included the doormat. Caleb let him in and locked the back door. He slept fine that night. He woke once at 2:40 a.m. when Nora made a small sound in the back room, but she settled herself within a minute, and the baby monitor went quiet. He lay in the dark for a while after that, listening to the ridge. No coyotes. The wood thrush was not going to call for another 2 hours. The pines made their noise when there was wind, a low collective sigh that was as much felt as heard, and that night there was no wind. The ridge was very quiet. He got up at 5:15 and made the coffee and drove to the gate. The scratch marks were on the 3rd pine from the fire lane, 11 feet into the trees on the east side, and he would have missed them entirely if he hadn't been angling off the lane to check the bearing on a boundary marker. The tree was a mature longleaf, 14 inches DBH, the bark plated and rough textured the way longleaf bark gets after 40 years of fire and recovery. The scratches ran vertically, 4 parallel lines gouged through the outer bark and into the sapwood, each about 3/4 of an inch wide. He found the bottom of the scratch pattern first, at roughly chest height on him, which was 5 feet 8. He followed the lines upward. They ran straight for about 2 feet, then another 2 feet, then another. He had to step back to see where they ended. The top of the scratch pattern was at 9 feet 4 inches. He measured it twice. He used the measuring tape clipped to his chest pocket. The highest point of the marks was 9 feet 4 inches above the ground. He stood there for a while. Then he got the tape and measured the width of the individual lines. Each was between 5/8 and 3/4 of an inch across. 4 lines, spacing between them consistent at roughly 2 inches on center. He wrote all of it in the field book. He took photographs with his phone, standing back far enough to get a reference object in the frame, using his hard hat on the ground at the base of the tree. He did not like how the phone camera made the marks look, flat and small and almost decorative, nothing like what they were in person. He took a dozen photographs anyway. He sat with the rational explanations on the drive back down the ridge. A black bear could scratch a pine tree. Black bears in central Alabama were not common on the ridge, but they were not impossible. And a large boar could reach high. He thought about the biggest bear track he had ever seen in 20 years of walking Alabama timber country and put it at roughly 7 inches. Then he thought about what height a bear of that track size could reach on a standing scratch, and he knew the math did not produce 9 feet 4. He also knew bear claw geometry and bear claw spacing, and what he had measured on that pine was neither. He discarded the bear explanation by the time he reached the bottom of the gravel road. He filed the data in the part of his mind that held unresolved questions and drove home for lunch. Walt Giddens had been running cattle and timber on the 2 ridges to the east for 34 years, and he had the particular quality of stillness that very old working men sometimes develop, where the stillness is not rest, but concentration. Caleb called him that afternoon and described the scratch marks without editorializing. Walt was quiet for a moment. "How high?" Walt asked. 9'4". Another pause. "That's high?" "Yes, it is." "You said 4 lines?" 4. Consistent spacing. Walt was quiet again for long enough that Caleb checked whether the call had dropped. "I've seen some things on that ridge over the years," Walt said finally. "Nothing I'd put a name to. What I'd tell you is I don't know, and I don't like not knowing." He paused. "I'd look around the base of that tree for hair, in the bark plates." Caleb had not thought of that. He thanked Walt and said he'd go back up in the morning. "Do it in daylight," Walt said. "Don't be on that ridge after dark right now." That was all Walt said about it. Caleb did not push for more because Walt's voice had said everything his words declined to. He told Sandra after Nora was down that evening. He kept it flat and factual. She listened at the kitchen counter, both hands around her coffee cup. When he finished, she asked how high. 9'4", he said. She looked at the baby monitor on the counter, then she looked back at him. "Is the back gate latched?" "It's latched." She nodded and didn't ask more questions. That was her way. She processed things internally and came out the other side with a decision or a question, never with noise in between. He had married her partly for that quality. He went outside and checked the back gate a second time. The porch light made its 30-foot circle and stopped. The ridge was dark beyond the fence. He stood there for 2 minutes listening. Frogs in the creek bottom far enough away to sound like static. No coyotes. The pines made no sound because there was no wind. He went inside and locked the door. He was asleep by 10. He woke at 1:17 a.m. to complete silence. Not the ordinary silence of a quiet night, which still has depth to it. Small sounds at varying distances establishing the dimensions of the world. This was flat silence, the kind that meant everything that normally made noise had decided at the same moment to stop. He lay in the dark and waited for his ears to give him something. The frog chorus in the creek bottom was gone. Nora was breathing in the back room, audible through the monitor. That was the only sound in the house. Then something moved in the tree line. He did not see it. He heard it, or rather he heard the pines react to it, a brief disturbance in the canopy above the fence line, needles brushing together in a way that wind would not produce because there was no wind. A single displacement of something large moving through the upper tier of branches. Then nothing. He was at the back window in 4 seconds, standing to the side of the frame, not in it. The porch light was on and showed him the fence, the chain-link gate, the first 10 feet of pine rows beyond it. He looked at the gate. Latch closed. He looked at the tree line. He looked for a long time. Nothing moved. He did not go outside. He checked that the back door was locked. He went down the hall and looked in on Nora, who was asleep in the white crib, with one arm up beside her head, and the orange glow of the nightlight warming the room. He pulled the window closed and latched it. He went back to the bedroom and sat in the chair by the window for the next 3 hours with a flashlight and his 30.06 across his knees. Sandra woke at 3:30 and found him there, and did not say a word. She got her robe and went to make coffee, and he heard her in the kitchen moving quietly, not turning on the overhead light, not clattering anything. At 5:15 he drove to the gate. The generator was on a concrete pad at the side of the house, covered with a steel housing, and it ran the backup for the well pump and the chest freezer. Sandra checked it every morning. Thursday morning it had run all night, which it was supposed to do on its maintenance cycle. But when she went to shut it down after the cycle completed, the startup keypad was reading a fault code she had not seen before. Caleb came back from the ridge to look at it. The housing showed no damage. The fault code was a sensor trip, the kind that happened when the generator detected an irregular voltage draw or an external vibration event. He cleared the code and ran a manual cycle, and it started fine. He could not explain the vibration trip. He wrote it in the field book. He found the hair in the bark of the scratched pine that morning the way Walt had suggested. 3 separate fiber clusters caught in the rough plates of the bark between the scratch lines, each about 2 inches long, coarse and dark brown shading to near black at the tips. He bagged each sample in a Ziploc bag he kept in his vest for soil sampling. The fiber was not deer hair and it was not bear hair. The guard hairs he knew from 20 years of deer season were finer and shorter and a different color entirely. Bear hair he had found before in rubbing trees, and it was coarser but rounder in cross-section. What he had in the bags was coarser still, slightly kinked, with a texture his fingers kept wanting to call wire, but wasn't quite wire. He sealed the bags and labeled them with the date and GPS coordinates. He put the trail camera on the fire break gate post that afternoon, angled to cover the lane for 40 feet in both directions. It was a hardwire model with a 12-volt lid to a small battery box he strapped to the post. He had used it for hog sign all season, and it was reliable. He set it to 30-second video clips, triggered by motion, checked the arc of coverage with his phone, and locked it to the post with a cable lock. The cable was 3/16-inch braided steel with a 4-digit combination lock, the kind rated for deterrence against casual theft. He set the combination, wrapped the slack twice around the post, and pulled it tight. The battery box had enough charge for 72 hours of standby. He felt the minor satisfaction of a problem addressed with the right tool, the same feeling he got after correcting a bearing error in a boundary line. He did not examine that feeling closely. Then he called the county sheriff's non-emergency line and described what he had found. The deputy who took the call was polite and asked whether any property damage had occurred. Caleb told him about the tree. He described the scratch marks, the height, the 4-line pattern, the hair samples in the Ziploc bags. The deputy was quiet for a moment and then asked if he thought it was a bear. Caleb said he had considered that, and the measurements were not consistent with any bear he had encountered in the region. The deputy said he could have a patrol car come out and look around, and Caleb said yes and gave the address. The patrol car came by at 4:30 in the afternoon, drove the gravel road to the gate, sat for 10 minutes with the window down, and drove back out. The deputy called from the road to say he didn't see anything of concern and that Caleb should call back if anything escalated. He thanked the deputy and disconnected. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with the phone in his hand, then put it on the counter next to the baby monitor and went to check the back gate. That was Thursday. Thursday night he slept in the chair again, this time with the porch light and the workshop flood on both, wash in the backyard with overlapping pools of light. Nothing disturbed the fence line. At 3:20 a.m., he heard the coyotes for the first time in 4 nights, briefly. A single call from somewhere far north of the ridge. Then it cut off. He thought about that single call and what it meant that it stopped. Friday morning, the trail camera was gone. Not tampered with. Not repositioned or knocked sideways. Gone. The cable lock was on the post, with the cable cut clean. And the battery box was on the ground with its connection pulled, and the camera was nowhere in the fire lane or the brush on either side. He searched 40 feet in each direction. He found no footage, no memory card on the ground, no parts. He found a single partial impression in the clay of the fire lane that had not been there Thursday afternoon, roughly oval, approximately 12 inches at its widest point, pressed 3 inches into the red clay. The clay in the bottom of the impression had a different texture than the surrounding surface, as if the full weight had been applied over a very short time and released without the lateral smearing that a foot dragging or slipping would leave. He photographed it. He measured it. He wrote it in the field book. He stood in the fire lane for a long time, looking at the gate post where the camera had been. He called the county line again. He described the camera. The deputy said to file a theft report online and gave him the address for the county's citizen portal. He thanked the deputy and put the phone in his pocket. He drove back down the ridge and called Walt from the truck. "Camera's gone," he said. Walt was quiet for a moment. "Caleb, I want you to listen to me. Get your family out of that house for a few nights." "She won't go," Caleb said. "I already know she won't go." "Ask her anyway." He asked Sandra at lunch. She listened to the full account and then said, "Where would we go?" He named Sandra's mother's house in Shelby County, 2 hours north. Sandra said, "Nora's routine is here. Her things are here. And I'm not going to let something I can't see run us off our own property. She said it the way she said most things, quietly and without room for argument. He understood she was right and knew the conversation was over. He checked every window latch in the house that afternoon. He checked the chain-link gate twice. He moved the workshop flood to a position where it covered the northwest corner of the yard, the blind spot the porch light left where the fence cornered at the property line. Then he went to the back room and looked at Nora's window, a single hung unit that latched with a lever lock at the top of the lower sash. He checked the latch. He went to the hardware store in town and bought a secondary pin lock for the sash channel and installed it before dinner, drilling the hole himself with a 1/4-inch bit and fitting the pin through both the sash and the frame. The window could not be opened from the outside or lifted from its channel now, not without breaking the frame. He was in the kitchen after dinner when the baby monitor activated. It was 9:47 p.m. Nora had been down for an hour and a half. The monitor made its usual pre-sound static, the slight warble of the carrier frequency that preceded any audio, and then instead of Nora, it produced a sound that he felt in his chest before he understood what it was. A low, sustained resonance below the range where the monitor's small speaker could fully reproduce it. So what came through was more vibration than tone. Under that, higher in pitch, but ragged, a secondary sound, almost percussive, like two surfaces clicking together very rapidly in a cycle of roughly 4 per second. He stood at the counter and stared at the monitor. The sound continued for 6 or 7 seconds, and then stopped. The static resumed. Nora did not wake. Sandra was in the living room and came to the kitchen doorway. She had heard it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "That was outside the window," she said. He took the flashlight and the 30.06 and went to Nora's room first, because Nora was first. He looked through the window without standing in front of it, crouching to see past the sill at an angle. The workshop flood covered the yard to within about 15 feet of the back fence. Beyond the fence, in the first rows of pines, there was nothing he could see. He checked the pin lock. It was intact. He checked the sash. The window had not moved. He went outside through the front door, not the back, and circled the house. The 30.06 was at his shoulder by the time he came around the northeast corner, moving along the foundation toward the backyard. The flood covered the yard well. He moved to the fence and shone the flashlight into the first 3 rows of pines. He was looking for eye shine. At the fence line there was nothing. He moved the beam in a sweep slowly, starting low and working up. He stopped the beam at about 12 feet up in the canopy zone, where 2 adjacent pines' upper branches overlapped, because there was something wrong about the geometry of the branches. He held the light steady. 2 points of light, amber gold. Separated by a distance his eye immediately tried to translate into familiar terms, and could not, because the distance was wrong. He had measured deer eyeshine for years, knew raccoon eyeshine and the green flash of a cat's eyes in a beam, knew the red of possum. What he was looking at was amber gold and steady, not the startled flicker of an animal caught by surprise, not moving, just present. The spacing between the 2 points was approximately 14 inches. He put that number together with the height, roughly 12 feet above the ground, in the canopy fringe, and stood still. The eyeshine did not move. He took 1 step back toward the house, without lowering the flashlight. The eye shine tracked the movement. Not a turn of the head, no muscular displacement visible, just an adjustment of gaze that said the thing in the trees was not looking at the light, but at the man holding the light. He understood the difference. He had hunted long enough to understand the difference between an animal looking at a beam and an animal looking through a beam at the source. He backed to the porch door and went inside. He wrote down the eye shine height, the spacing, the color, and the duration in the field book. Then he called Walt. It was after 10. Walt picked up on the second ring. "I've got eye shine in the pines," Caleb said. 14-inch spacing, 12 feet up. Amber, stationary. It tracked me when I moved. Walt did not say anything for a moment. "Are you in the house?" "Yes. Stay there. Don't go back out tonight." "Walt, what have you seen on your ridge?" The pause was long enough that Caleb counted to 8. 3 years ago, I found a kill site in the creek bottom on the east end of my property," Walt said. "White-tailed doe. The carcass had been moved. Not dragged. Moved. Carried. The way you'd move something you intended to come back to. I found the place she'd been set down, about, 40 yards from where she died, against a fallen oak. Something had pulled her up under the overhang of the root ball. I don't know an animal that does that." He stopped. "I don't talk about it much." 3 years ago, Caleb said. 3 years ago. Nothing since, until maybe 2 weeks back. My cattle dog started refusing to go past the fence line at night. She's a cow dog. She doesn't refuse fences. Caleb held the field book and did not write anything for a moment. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" "Because I had nothing to tell you," Walt said. "I still barely have anything to tell you, you hear me? I have a dog that won't go past a fence and a dead doe under a root ball from 3 years back. That's nothing you can take anywhere." He understood what Walt meant. He also understood that Walt had not slept well in 2 weeks. He could hear it. "Come tomorrow," Caleb said. "In daylight. I want you to look at the scratch marks." Walt came Saturday morning at 8, driving his flatbed down the gravel road in the low overcast that had been holding since Thursday, the sky the color of old ash. Caleb walked him up the fire lane to the scratched pine. Walt stood in front of the tree for a long time, hands in his jacket pockets, not touching the bark, just looking at the height of the marks. Then he looked at the ground around the base of the tree. He crouched and pressed his thumb into the clay at the far side of the root flare, where the ground was softer in the tree's shadow, and held it there. "You measured these?" Walt asked, still looking at the marks. 9-4 to the top? Walt stood up and put his hands back in his pockets. He looked at Caleb. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it plainly. Whatever is using this ridge, it's not confused about where you live. It's not passing through." He looked at the scratch marks one more time. At the topmost line, the one at 9 feet 4 inches. And then he looked away into the trees. "I'd pull your family off that property tonight." "She won't go," Caleb said. "Then you need to be very careful tonight." He walked Walt back to the flatbed. Walt shook his hand at the driver's door. "Call me in the morning," Walt said. "Early." He drove back down the gravel road, and Caleb watched the truck until it turned onto the county road and was gone. He spent the afternoon rigging. He moved his 2 additional portable work floods to the back corners of the yard, running their extension cords through the workshop window, and tested the coverage. He walked the fence line with the floods on, standing at the corners and crouching at the midpoints, looking for gaps. With the porch light, the original flood, and the two portables. The backyard was lit to the fence line with overlapping sources. No gap larger than 3 feet. The junction of the chain link and the pine row was the problem area, where the fence post met the first tree and the flood beam clipped the top of the wire without going very deep into the timber. He angled the northeast portable to cover that corner specifically and tested it twice. He ran the F250 into the pull-through and left it parked with the hood facing the backyard so the headlights could be triggered from the dash without turning the engine on. He thought about the gap between the gate and the first pine row, 12 feet of open ground that the headlights would cover if he positioned the truck correctly, which he did, angling the front wheels 2 degrees toward the northeast corner. He sat in the cab for a moment, checking the sight lines through the windshield. Then he got out. He checked the 30.06 and loaded the .357 revolver and set the revolver on the nightstand where he could reach it from the bed in the dark. He moved the 30.06 to the bedroom closet with the door open. He told Sandra to stay away from the windows after dark, specifically the back room window, and to take the baby monitor to the bedroom with her. She looked at the yard at the lights he had set up at his face and said nothing. She carried Nora on her hip and touched the back of his arm once as she passed him in the hall and went to check the crib. He heard her in the back room, moving the furniture slightly, checking the pin lock on the window the way he had shown her. She put the diaper bag on the bedroom floor within reach of the bed. She did not argue with any of it. Nora went down at 8. Caleb was in the kitchen at 8:15 when the backyard lights flickered. All of them simultaneously for 1 second, as if something had passed through the circuit. Then steady again. He walked to the back window and looked at the yard. Nothing in the yard. The fence was closed and latched. The pines beyond the fence were dark in the gaps between the flood coverage. At 9:30, the baby monitor activated again. This time it was longer. The low resonance came through first, that chest-felt bass, and then the secondary sound underneath it, the chattering vibration. 2 distinct tones working in the same transmission, and what was unmistakable this time was that the sound was not at the distance it had been Friday night. It was closer to the mic. He was moving before it finished, down the hall to the bedroom. Not running, moving fast and controlled. Sandra was already awake, already at the crib. He took Nora from the crib and put her in Sandra's arms and said, "Back corner of the bedroom, away from the window." Sandra went without a word. He went to Nora's room. The window was intact. The pin lock was holding. The sash had not moved. He crouched below the sill and looked out from the low angle, and what he saw made him straighten and step back. The window screen was pushed inward at the lower left corner, bowed into the room by 1.5 inches, the spline coming away from the frame. The screen itself was not torn. The mesh was intact. Something had applied steady pressure to the exterior of the screen at the lower corner, and the screen had yielded, bowing inward until the pin lock on the sash stopped any further progress. He stood in the room with the revolver in his hand and looked at the bowed screen for a long time. Then he went to the truck. He climbed in through the passenger side, not wanting to be silhouetted against the interior light, and worked across to the driver's seat and pulled the door closed without latching it. He triggered the headlights from the dash. The floods were already on. The yard went white. He sat in the cab and looked through the windshield at the full-lit backyard and saw nothing but the fence and the first 3 rows of pines. He waited. At 11:20 p.m., the gate latch lifted. He watched it. The chain-link gate to the fire lane was 12-gauge wire on a steel frame, and the latch was a spring-loaded bar that seated in a slotted keeper on the post. He had checked it twice. He was watching it lift. Not shake, not rattle, lift. As if a hand had found it in the dark and understood the mechanism and pressed up from beneath. The gate swung inward 4 inches and stopped. He turned on the truck's high beams. What the high beams showed him, he would spend the following days trying to reduce to a set of facts he could write in a field book, because that was the only framework he had. He would write 8.5 feet upright, standing just past the open gate at the edge of the fire lane, facing the truck, wide through the shoulders in a way that did not map to any animal he knew, the width of the shoulders greater than the spread of his own arms, the head long and forward, not round, with the ears set high and pointed, distinct above the crown, the forearms heavy, hanging at an angle that was not quite human, the hands or whatever occupied the ends of the forearms, held slightly out from the body, the fur dark brown to near black in the headlight wash, long guard hairs catching the light along the shoulder line and the outer edges of the arms, the coat, with a depth to it that was not flat like a deer's coat, but had a dimensional quality, as if the layers of fur were working independently. The eyes were amber gold. He could see that even against the full beam of the high beams, the self-luminous quality of them overriding the wash of white light. The spacing was 14 inches. He knew because he had already measured it in the dark 2 nights before, and what he was looking at now confirmed the number. It stood at the gate, and it did not move. It was not startled. It was not frozen in the headlights the way a deer freezes, the reactive paralysis of an animal that cannot process the threat. It was still because it chose to be still. He understood that in his chest, before he understood it in his mind, the way you understand certain things about a stranger before a word has been exchanged, the quality of their attention, whether they are measuring you or whether you are merely in their way. He sat in the cab with his hand on the door handle and the 30.06 across his lap. The high beams put 200 feet of fire lane on display beyond the gate. The red clay pale in the white light, the long leaf pines standing in dark rows on both sides. Lonesome Pine Ridge was in there somewhere in that dark, the ridge he had walked for 11 years, the acreage he knew better than any ground he had ever put his boots on. The gate was 4 inches open. The thing at the gate was 8.5 feet tall and had come out of the ridge to stand in his headlights, and it was looking at him. Caleb Merritt did not panic. He was not the kind of man who panicked. He checked things, and he wrote things down, and he built a factual account of what the world had produced in his presence. And he would do all of those things, and he would get Walt on the phone at first light, and he would add 9 more numbers to the field book. Right now he was in the truck with his hand on the door handle, and the night was on the other side of the door, and the thing at the gate had not moved. His hand did not move either.